proposed by Xi Jinping in Baogang Forum represents an important step China has taken to discover its continental regions and develop regional security governance. Chinese perception of region has a global dimension. It is a globalized Asia. That's very important, the globalizing. The idea of globalized Asia refers to the fact Asia is conceptualized globally, and it is not defined in a narrow term that focuses on regional organizations like ASEAN and South China Sea. Chinese notion of Asia also including South Asia, Central Asia. So Wang Jisi, for example, a top international relations scholar and a former dean of School of International Study at Beijing University, argues that China needed to develop a geopolitical rebalance strategy. Rather than focus on the maritime, China should focus on its development in the inner external West, linked to Central Asia and Europe. That's extremely important for China to develop its own regional imagination, connect Central Asia with Europe. In addition, there are some new unfolding ideas of regions that are not strategic articulated yet, but which follow the economic security logic. It is a new region that included not only Pacific Ocean, but also Indian Ocean. It is a combination of a continental and a maritime region. That's important. It's a hybridity, Chinese development notion. They combine continental and a maritime region. Thus, Chinese perception of region has extended from the continental region to a Pacific Ocean and to the Indian Ocean. China is a dialogue partner of the Indian Ocean Ring Association and has doubled its budget through the aid to this organization. It is as a part of this cognitive shift that China found this notion of Indo-Pacific fits its strategic interest quite well. So it is worth mentioning that Chinese understanding of Indo-Pacific also including African part of Indian Ocean. That's important. That's really different from India or Indonesia, even Australia. As well, Chinese strategic consideration of connecting the Atlantic, Pacific, Indian Ocean, Beijing deal with Northeast Africa states are illustrated in this regard. With projects such expansion of the Suez Canal, construction of a new Egyptian administrative capital, as well Chinese first military base outside China in Djibouti. Chinese geopolitical influence will be increased felt at the confluence of the Indian and Mediterranean Atlantic Oceans. So with Chinese perception of the region is unfolding without a clear defined boundary, it has several key features. So let me summarize the feature. First, underpinning Chinese contemporary grand strategy is a revised, extended version of Asian perception Middle Kingdom. Start with Beijing, extend to outside. Second, Chinese perception region is a hybrid in that it is combination continental and maritime. And third, I think important that this perception of region has institutional bearing. So let's discuss how Chinese involving perception region in practice. So I will examine two cases to illustrate how China's define its notion of region and its implication for regional institutional buildings. So those two cases can be seen as a Chinese strategic response to the Indo-Pacific strategy. I will leave to you to judge whether or not this strategic response to Indo-Pacific are successful. So let's first look at the case of the Shanghai Cooperation Organizations. So Shanghai Cooperation Organization was formed and co-sponsored by China and Russia in 1996, and including 4 Central Asian countries. So SCO is not alliance, no, it is security community. It is a cooperative multi-state organizations. It is the SCO observer state, including Mongolia. Now, last year, very important, both India and Pakistan formally became member of SCO. So it is debatable whether this expansion is driven by Russia in order to dilute the Chinese influence. If they get the India in, so they can dilute Chinese influence. But the fact that expansion of the SCO support realization of Chinese new regional imagination, a type of a grand project of regional integration between Indian Ocean and Central Asia. China hopes that this expansion will ease India-Pakistan rival so that it will help China to develop its BIR project in both India and Pakistan. So another very complicated is whether to what extent Turkey wants to apply to be a member of SCO. That's we'll see another Chinese expansions in terms of Chinese-led regional organizations. So certainly, as some scholars acknowledge, expansion of SCO to include Pakistan and India attest to Chinese strategic imaginations. And in particular, acknowledges the Chinese influence in the Indian Oceans. So most important, I think, when it comes to this issue, to respond to the US-led airline system in Indo-Pacific. So China took the first move that is including India as part of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So to include India, there will be attempts to prevent from US-led airlines from developing into a regional airlines bloc. So if we look at this, Indo-Pacific so far is kind of your talk these ideas, strategy implication. So what China do is doing something on the ground, first including Pakistan, India, into their China-led regional organization. That is a Chinese response to the Indo-Pacific. Let's look at the second examples. That is what we call this China-CEE cooperation. So that's the Beijing's 6+1 framework. This framework is an example of Chinese, another new regional imagination, very much like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire expanded its influence, they have their version into the Central Asia. Chinese is this is similar to this kind of attempts. And so this is another type of regional integration between China, 11 European Union member states, 5 Balkan countries. For Chinese, the 16+1 hold geo-economic unity, boasting logistic corridors and important transshipment harbors. With the BRRs of Chinese global engagement, Chinese notion of the region, such as 6+1, are likely to assume great geopolitical as well as geoeconomic significance moving forward. China's CCEE can be seen as a Chinese new strategy move. Rather than confront with the United States in the Indo-Pacific region, China opened its new geostrategic front, in particular new marketing in Central Asia, in the Europe and Central Asia. So this is a concrete example of Chinese globalized Asia. It is the Europe-Asia connection as a strategic response to US-led Indo-Pacific. Again, here, Chinese CEE, including US airline member state. In this way, I leave to you to judge whether Chinese is successful to weak and divide US airline system. So China reimagined Chinese CEE region in contrast to prevailing West European orthodoxy. In particular, it challenged existing perception of the European region. So Elmo, this is really frustrating for European. European really frustrated by this Chinese new move because you really divide the whole Europe in Chinese way. So this is really worrisome for European policy maker and also European scholar. But on the other hand, perhaps Europe needed to adjust its position about the exclusive membership of European Union and its conception of the European region. As United Kingdom did to accommodate United States redefinition of East Asian region in the past. Perhaps Europe should follow the UK did it before, readjust its perception of region to accommodate Chinese imagination of the region. Okay, so let me just finally, let's just concluding finally, let's comment on this ASEAN. So this, what's the implication for ASEAN? So we already see quite a few articles going on talking about how ASEAN should work hard to fit Japan or US-led Indo-Pacific building. And in particular, Indonesia and Singapore make great effort to reconsider Indo-Pacific region in a variety of ways, very actively. But ASEAN as a whole, as a unity, so far ASEAN has failed to develop its grand strategy to deal with the idea of Indo-Pacific and also to deal with the Chinese strategic response to Indo-Pacific. So I think the neglect by ASEAN as a regional organization should be considered a blind spot in ASEAN's strategic outlook. That should be really important issue. I had a privilege this morning talk with Professor Aaron Chong, and we've been discussing that one of the issues to strengthen ASEAN to respond to this idea of Indo-Pacific Chinese involving perception of the region, is ASEAN should expand its membership, including Australia as a new member of ASEAN. In that way, ASEAN give ASEAN a new opportunity, revival, rethink this big strategic issue. But of course, there's so many obstacles come from Australia, or the Australian mentality is still far behind. But also there's obstacle within ASEAN member. But at least the reconsidering the ASEAN membership is the starting points to meet this global, this global challenge, in particular this, what we talk, rethinking of the region. Thank you very much. Welcome your comments and criticism.
Thank you very much, Professor Baogang He. At this juncture, I would like to call the two discussants from PHISO. First, Frankie Cruz. I would like to call Professor Baogang to have a seat in front.
I'd like to thank Professor Baogang He for delivering that enlightening speech. When we think about the power of China, I think that for many, at least for those who encounter China on a casual basis, we know of it as a historical power, that it's a power that has for a while lost its power, and before it used to be something that figured quite highly in regional trade, for example. The Silk Road was not only a continental form of trade, but it was also, it had maritime routes. And when we think about that and we look at how China is looking at its strategic options for the 21st century, we see that China is also starting to move west, both in a maritime sense and also through the land, right, with the projects like Obor, etc., that is really showing that we are a growing power, that we want to project our capabilities, our strategy throughout a region which we are redefining, perhaps also according to historical thoughts, historical perceptions of its old power. I wonder if maybe this history plays into its current geostrategic plans, perhaps, might be the right word. I think for ASEAN in particular, it's very interesting about this response because when we think about ASEAN, why it developed in the very first place, we think that of the norms such as non-interference, for example, because of economic development. And that for a while has been one of the key features of ASEAN, that you don't interfere with what I'm doing in my country. You focus instead on developing yourselves economically. And I think that ASEAN identity has somewhat been concretized. It's not only elite-driven sort of identity, but it's been concretized into these norms that you don't interfere. ASEAN comprises of the states that it does comprise. And letting in a power such as Australia into ASEAN for strategic regions really makes a lot of people think. I think there were a lot of raised eyebrows when there was a suggestion to allow Australia to come into ASEAN, simply because the ASEAN identity has already somewhat been fossilized, and at the same time has not been a democratic kind of identity. So it's very interesting to see that you see here these two different ways of thinking about of regionalization, that you have ASEAN on one hand, with its own ideas of what a region is, accepting Australia for strategic purposes when ASEAN might have had a different idea of what a region was in the past. And I think accepting Australia would then require a different justification for why there is ASEAN. Is ASEAN simply an organization that existed for the same reason it did during the Cold War, to develop its own national economies? Or is it now really a strategic region thinking forward that is trying to combat maybe Chinese power, trying to balance against the expansion of China towards the West. And I think it's not a coincidence that many Western powers and even those who are within Asia are looking towards the East simply because of the rise of China and how valuable that is in our in the geopolitical configuration of the world. I also wonder, in terms of, because we've looked at, I think in this presentation, both the geographic expanse and economic and political justifications for that strategic thinking. And I'm wondering if the argument of Joseph Nye that it's not just about you know how much control you have over territory, it's about the norms that you project from your own country. So we're thinking about norms here like soft power, and I think that's one of the highlights of both European and American power, that they were not just projecting, let's say, development aid. They were also saying, well, you know, we have this liberal democratic culture, and perhaps that might be a good thing for you. So does China really have any ambitions in that sense? Does it have any normative ambitions? Or is it the kind of power that leaves countries alone to do as they please? I think that's also very interesting, and whether or not the populations of those countries also welcome Chinese expansion or the Chinese rethinking of a region. Because if we think of a region that is elite-driven or that is driven from the top down, what about the populations themselves? And I think in the European setting, this might be very interesting because if we look at the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, it was also an ideational conflict. It was one about identity. Ukrainians had a problem with Russia because of an identity. There was an identity dimension to it rather than also a political one. So would identity then be an issue when it comes to this kind of region rather than you know, simply the political, strategic side to it? I think that it is really quite fascinating to see things from a Chinese perspective, because especially in the Philippines, we tend to always get either an ASEAN or an US kind of perspective when we think about a region or when we think about the Asia Pacific. And it's very enlightening for us to see now how China is thinking about the maritime issue, and I think it's a very controversial issue perhaps in the Philippines. It's hotly debated, especially now with the foreign policy decisions and moving towards China. And looking to the future, that might be something that we have to consider in our foreign policy. How do we approach Chinese power? How do we relate to China as opposed to maybe the US, which has been a traditional ally for the Philippines for many years? We've always had a somewhat closer position to the US. Perhaps another region that we might like to think about here, and great powers always somehow define regions, and I think Professor Baogang, he expressed that quite succinctly when he said that when we think about regions, it's very Western in its orientation. Even the word Middle East is a function of Western strategy. We accept it as, we take it for granted. I mean, even in the Middle East themselves, they've used the term to describe themselves. And now that China is a growing power, will this also reflect on the people? Will they accept it? And also say, well, we're Poland and we are these countries that are bordering Western Europe. Will we have our own identity that is largely defined by China? So maybe it might have something to do with these new and developing identities. And the role of Africa, as I mentioned before. Africa has always been, I think, quite ignored in world politics. Everyone treats it as their own backyard. And now China is now strategically moving towards Africa because of the inclusion of Africa in the western part of the Indian Ocean, which, as you mentioned, is not really considered by India in its own formulation of region. So how would Africa then play a role in maybe vying for regional power and redefining regions of where we have influence? In terms of Europe, I mean, is Europe looking towards Africa now that China has an interest in it? Or has China really discovered a new potential for expanding its influence across the globe with its route to Africa and consciously including Africa as part of its geostrategic conception? So I think that would be my discussion.
Thank you, Frankie. May I call in Brian Doce from the De La Salle University.
Thank you very much, Professor, for also the informative talk. I think majority of my points were already shared by Frankie. So to be short, I have 4 questions. Number 1, I would like to ask whether if it is possible to explore the Chinese perception of the Indo-Pacific in a constructivist lens. For example, we're going to look on the strategic culture, the organizational culture inside Chinese bureaucracy. And then second, what do you think is the implications of Xi Jinping's re-election, wherein his presidency will no longer be terminated? It's for lifespan. And then number three is, what do you think is the extent of China's willingness to carry the cost of the construction of these regional efforts? And then last, what do you think is the extent of China's willingness to carry the burden of the costs? Yes, sir. On the construction of these regional efforts. And then lastly, the same question with Frankie. What do you think is the role of Chinese history on China's regional efforts on its westward regional efforts? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Brian. Professor, would you like to respond?
So thank you for excellent comments. And as Europe always project its norm, soft power. So certainly when it comes to the aid, and like Australia gave the money, usually have attached certain conditions. You need to improve the governance, improve human rights record, democracy. So there are some advantage in terms of soft power. But at the same time, I think I try to say this, on the one hand, on one particular issue, China has advantage. Advantage in the sense the Chinese pragmatism. So if we think about the West, this norm, there's two serious problems. One of the problem is that when the United Kingdom and the United States come to Asia, they will spread its regions everywhere. So as a part of their economic expansions. And the Chinese economic expansion, so far, they don't sell its Chinese religion. China actually don't have any good religion you can spread. So China so far, when it comes to One Belt, One Road, China so far is quite successful deal with Islamic country, Muslim country. It was said that China will face the cultural resistance from this Islamist. But so far, no big problem. There are a few small problems. So that's different from the West. China will never sell its religion. But despite this, they have the Confucian institution everywhere. But they are most language. It's a very little touch on core Confucian value. Then on the second issues, like the Western norm issue, is the sale of democracy. But we already see this American promotion democracy prove disaster in Middle East, in Iraq, in Syria. It really get so many trouble. I was reading an article by the Iraq professor published New York Times that basically said Americans destroy our countries and by the promoting democracy. So on those two fronts, China is pragmatism. They will not repeat the mistake by the West. But then on another issue that the West tends to overlook is the Chinese pragmatism. Chinese One Belt, One Road, even this reimagined region, it's a pure pragmatism. That is, they want to do some business, build the road, build infrastructure connections. So that is based on a great shared value, which the Asian people desperately need, the value of development. Every Asian country today in the poor country desperately need infrastructure. And then China meet such demands. And that's the value, pragmatic value. then where the China can work with other countries. So in terms of the, can you see the soft power? You can also, it's a different from American style, you know. The issue is this, I also come back to this issue, I said rethinking this, as you said clear again, even the notion of East is a Western construction. So eventually China will disrupt those traditional concept of geography concept, slowly. Because one of the example is Turkey. So Turkey was kind of originally regarded as a part of Europe, part of Asia. So in the Chinese way, clearly Turkey will be more seen as an Asia. So Central Asia, also Asia. Even Russia, to some extent, at the moment, Russia tends to redefine as a European country. But now Russia is thinking Euro-Asia. They put the Asia in it. So here we'll give two examples. It's a concept region that slowly change. So as I said, the Chinese is kind of unfolding, and so there will be a slow process, and in particular, it's fascinating. That's a Chinese perception of the Greek. Greek was regarded as the birthplace of Western civilization. But from Chinese kind of new discovery, archaeology discovery, they said Greek actually was Asia, part of Asia, not West. It's very fascinating to look at this Chinese reinterpretation of the Western civilization. So one of the there's another question. Just was a Chinese perception region have the cultural dimension. I found that China has so far a less cultural dimension. It's more pragmatism, and so the other issue is a kind of cost issue. Bear the cost. I was in Malaysia, fascinating. When Malaysia's own company cannot competing with China, so Chinese will say, okay, we build this road for you, some road, railway. You don't need to pay any interest. We complete the project, no interest. But then the domestic company, you need some money. China just will do everything for you. So it's fascinating. This kind of Chinese state SOEs are willing to do so.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Baogang. Now I open the floor to questions from the audience. Please raise your hand. Proceed to the microphones in the center aisle. State where you're from. Anyone? Oh yeah, Professor Allen.
Professor, thank you for your provocative talk. I'd just like to pick up 2 points from the very interesting maps that you showed. In particular, I'd like to ask you how much of this redrawing of the geopolitical map is actually no more than a redefinition of China's old socialist alliances. Some of them may not be alliances, but still, there is a socialist commonwealth. Because all of Eastern Europe used to be friends of China, even during the Cold War. Is it just an update of that? And the same thing with Central Asia. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization was part of the old socialist world. It was part of then Soviet Union. And just because the Soviet Union has become the CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States, so it's just easy to pick up where you left off. Now, the second question, and I'll just make this short, concerns China's sudden interest in the North Arctic, the Northern Sea Route. They call it the Arctic Sea Route because of climate change. Now there is a viable mercantile route through the ice. Does this mean that Scandinavia will one day also be part of China's new imagination? I don't know what it's going to be called. Scandinavian 4+1? Thank you.
Professor, would you like to answer?
So the first question, my answer clearly is no. So there are some parts that is China easy to develop business with a former Soviet Union republic, also East Europe, because historically they have connections. They have a personal connection. So easy to do business. That's a pure because of that. And it's unlikely China can articulate a socialist value as a common ground for its regional imagination. So far, the Chinese idea of socialism, which Xi Jinping's new socialism, was written into the constitution, party constitution, and state constitution, is largely limited to domestic matter. It's largely a sort of propaganda, no substances. So I doubt it's this kind of real ideological revival. Unlikely, it won't work out. So it's more likely it's a hybrid because the Chinese success largely still based liberal market. That's the key issues. So, but on the other hand, as we discussed earlier, the Chinese civilization, China built this empire long time ago, historically, largely is according to this old thesis, is because China tried to deal with the fraud issue. So there they need to build this, deal with the fraud. They mobilize people to deal with the fraud. That is, they build a strong centralized state. Now, that version can be revived in today. When China built all the road everywhere, it's kind of revival Chinese, this kind of Chinese influences. So we will see kind of Chinese new type of economic empire, not a political empire, economic empire. That is already take shape. And now that is confronted with the American empire. So the two empires entangles, and now they're in the conflict.
Okay. Yes, Professor in white. Sir?
Hi, Yoichiro Sato from Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University. Professor He, in your talk, I didn't hear much about Russia, and you were talking about the China's kind of inroads into Central Asia and also Eastern Europe as a means of opening a new front against the perceived containment by the United States in the Indo-Pacific. But can China actually do that without close support from Russia about this new engagement with Central Asia and Eastern Europe? And how would, also from the perspective of the states in